This media content is brought to you by Right Dream Productions. There are various historical accounts explored by the likes of notable historian and Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams of Trinidadian of First Nation chiefs known as caciques and their war chiefs engaging in battles against Spanish colonizers. Popular Taino cacique Hatue and the more popular Nepuyo cacique Hiarima, who followed years later, after whom the royal borough of Ahirima is named, frequently challenged the European invaders who used Roman Catholicism to convert the captured and enslaved Taino peoples. Renowned historian Carlton Otley, in his 1970 publication The Story of Port of Spain, From the Earliest Times to the Present Day, provides historical insights into an important yet unique event in the history of Trinidad. Otley states that Don Antonio Sedano reported to the King of Spain of an account involving a fierce type of insurgency operation mounted by a conglomerated Amerindian fighting force which combined the skill and tactics of different tribes. At 4 a.m. on September the 13th, 1533, in a part of Port of Spain, which the First Nations people called Mucurapo, Sedano reported that the group of fighters descended from the hills with loud war chants in large numbers. They killed many Spanish soldiers, and Sedano and the other survivors barely managed to escape. Sedano did return, but this battle, according to Otley, along with Sedano's lack of provisions, forced him to leave the island in 1534, which resulted in many Amerindian feasts and celebrations to honor the event. The United Amerindian fighters managed to drive the occupying Europeans from their lands. Of course, this was short-lived, as the Spanish eventually returned. The Mucurapo lands would some 457 years later provide the basis upon which another tribe, led by a different type of cacique and war chiefs, would eventually take on what they perceived to be a larger enemy. This is the battle for Mucurapo.
The Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet are under arrest. The Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet are under arrest. The Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet are under arrest.
Large aspects of the narrative contained within this episode have been derived from the testimonies of witnesses and the conclusions of the Commission of Inquiry into the attempted coup in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on Friday, the 27th of July, 1990. The Jamaat. Origins, early 1970s. Branch of Islam, Sunni. Current membership, unknown. Founder, Imam Yassin Abu Bakr. Despite the incarnation and reincarnation of several political parties, their rise, fall, and a host of politicians across the political spectrum. For some reason, the Jamaat has endured. It also remains deeply entrenched in the psyche of Trinidad and Tobago, and its place is forever embedded in history on account of its attempt in July of 1990 to remove the Republic's democratically elected government. The Jamaat, as an Islamic religious organization, was officially formed in the 1970s, and much of its social work highlighted one of the more pronounced examples of the failure of the civil society of Trinidad. For many, it represents an egregious failure of the state. For reasons that will be explained, an interdisciplinary approach will be adopted in order to obtain a better understanding of the Jamaat, its place in the society, and the impact that it has had on the evolution of the Twin Island Republic. In order to understand the Jamaat and July 27th, we need to first take a look at the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement resulted in an explosion of ideology and consciousness which in many ways sought to hold to account the failures of the Twin Islands independence project. What started off as a peaceful protest on Thursday, the 26th of February 1970, at the Canadian High Commission in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and eventually making its way to the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in solidarity with students of the Sir George Williams University in Canada, resulted in protesters being arrested. Many within the society felt that independence and decolonization had gone awry and failed to fulfill promises, let alone to correctly rearrange the hierarchical structure of class, elitism at state boards, inequality, and disproportionality. Sovereignty remained qualified since the colonial government had not yet fully vacated the Twin Island. As such, the footsteps of the Black Power revolutionary ideology reverberated across the country. Although mobilized largely under the rubric of Afrocentrism, the movement managed in the most Trinbagonian of ways to homogenize disgruntlement and dissatisfaction, thus producing its idiosyncratic brand of Black Power. This meant that Black Power was expressed neither exclusively for nor exclusively by Afro-Trinidadians, but also by Indo-Trinidadians and other groups challenging structural imbalances and inequality. Major stakeholders included the sugar and petroleum trade unions and their respective leadership. The movement was led by the National Joint Action Committee, which was formed by the University of the West Indies students and led by Macandal Dagger and Kafra Kambon. The Black Power movement seemed on course to remove the administration of the day, the People's National Movement government. Led by Dr. Eric Williams, the PNM was held responsible for the unsettled grievances of the British, whom many felt escaped unscathed. The irony was that Williams, a black prime minister whose groundbreaking academic treatise into the history of the people of Trinidad, the wider Caribbean, and the impact of sugar and slavery, had to justify himself to the Black Power movement by listing the government's achievements.
At all levels, you have lack of training.
On the 6th of April 1970, however, things were to take a deadly turn. At a peaceful protest located near Woodford Square in Port of Spain, Basil Thomas, a Black Power protester, was shot and killed by a police officer. The public outcry was incredible and ignited an unspoken accord as his funeral drew an enormous turnout. The PNM government even lost Member of Parliament A.N.R. Robinson, who resigned symbolically in protest on the 13th of April of 1970. Despite his efforts at persuasion, Dr. Williams remained unable to convince the Black Power movement through appeasement. Holding on to power, he responded through law and might by activating a state of emergency. The SOE restricted protests and marches, enabling the police to stifle such activities. Black Power leaders were arrested and detained, sometimes at secret locations, and many were kept on the prison colony of Nelson Island. At times, leaders and members were detained in small and overcrowded cells. The Black Power movement sought peaceful challenges to the power structure through protests, marches, sit-ins, and rallies. However, there were instances of organized violence, and the revolutionary movement's ideology started to spread. On the 21st of April 1970, an SOE had been activated as all the unions pooled their resources and manpower. Soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the regiment, acting on orders, proceeded to collect their weapons and ammunition from the bunker in Tetron Barracks, Chaguaramas, when a group led by Sandhurst trained officers Lieutenant Rafiq Shah, Reginald Lassell, and others who subscribed to the ideology of Black Power staged a mutiny. The group was initially detained by soldiers who were opposed to the mutiny, but were subsequently freed when a sympathizer escaped and gathered support. The Trinidad Guardian reported, The fear was that the army which outgunned and outmanned the police would storm the city in support of the Black Power activists who were demonstrating and calling for the overthrow of the Eric Williams-led government. In fact, in spite of pay increases, many of the soldiers had more interest in the Black Power movement than in the army. The TTDF headquarters was overtaken by mutineers as the violent winds of insurrection threatened the independence project. A convoy consisting of trucks, troop carriers, jeeps, and a few civilian cars left Tetron barracks bound for Port of Spain. Approximately 13 miles, and the Twin Islands' peace and security would have been under threat. All was not lost, however, as soldiers and sailors faithful to the Constitution escaped the mutineers and opened fire on the ammunition bunker. They then turned their attention to the convoy and opened fire. Soldiers scampered for safety. Some dropped their rifles while others went AWOL. In the end, Clyde Bailey, a young private, lost his life having been decapitated in the firefight. Supported by other faithful members of the Coast Guard who were aboard Trinity, a defensive perimeter was established outside Chaguaramas. What remained a point of secret to many until 2001 was that Britain was monitoring the situation in Trinidad. After all, there were 2,000 British subjects on the islands and £150 million worth of its investments. Declassified British cabinet records show that Dr. Williams made a call for troops from Nigeria and Tanzania with the request that Britain assist with armament and the transport of these troops to Trinidad. Why African countries, one might ask? Well, he was promised 1,000 troops by Venezuela, but may have opted for African troops for 4 reasons. Firstly, Dr. Williams established a unique relationship with African countries and was held in high regard by most of them. After all, many of the Commonwealth countries became a sort of fraternity as they were attaining independence around the same time. Then there is the second reason, the optics. The images of white British soldiers suppressing a black revolution could have radicalized neutral or inactive Black Power sympathizers. Thirdly, while American support may have seemed a logical request, Dr. Williams, who was Chief Minister in 1957, remained consistent in his desire to divest the Twin Isles of colonialism. He wanted the complete removal of the American military, whose presence on the islands, it was argued, dangerously absorbed Trinidad into the Cold War. The geostrategic importance of Trinidad for the United States, however, which formed the foundation of Churchill's masterful diplomatic destroyers for bases 99-year lease agreement in 1941, was never lost on the military tacticians and technocrats in Washington. This stance made Dr. Williams and the People's National Movement hugely unpopular with Washington. It also informs the understanding of many as to why, in subsequent elections, the United States took the position of supporting Trinidad's opposition. There is also the fact that Americans were wary of states within its sphere of influence whose political arrangements did not contain term limits for their political leaders. He was critical of America, and the Twin Islands maintained a non-aligned foreign policy approach which enabled a relationship with Castro and the USSR. Like Britain, the United States had citizens and investments there, and despite Dr. Williams's failure to request American support, an April 26, 1970, New York Times article states that 6 United States Navy ships were ordered by the Pentagon in Washington and dispatched from Puerto Rico to the Twin Island nation, and remained 50 to 60 miles off of Trinidad's coast. The fourth crucial reason may have been that much of Dr. Williams' rhetoric leading up to independence in 1962 was couched in terms of political maturity and not needing Britain. Therefore, the implication of Britain having to run to its aid to suppress an internal revolution despite the social sophistication and intellectualism of Williams himself would have been an embarrassing symbolic defeat for the decolonization and independence movement. Considerations fell to British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who would in 2 months exit the corridors of Downing Street at defeat to the Conservatives. Through his Defence Secretary, Wilson made the decision to deploy frigates to Trinidad. HMS Sirius contained a detachment of Royal Marines, while HMS Jupiter, equipped with a helicopter and could provide a naval landing party for 2 platoons trained in riot control, was instructed to stay out of sight at 30 miles offshore. The insurrection was put down after 4 days. Shah and others surrendered and were detained. In total, court-martial proceedings were initiated, and 83 accused soldiers were discharged. Shah's oratory at his trial was frighteningly brilliant and is worthy of its own inquiry, but it was insufficient as he received 20 years, while his co-convicted officers received less. However, the men only served 27 months as the Court of Appeal found that they were denied a fair trial, with the Privy Council also eventually ruling against the state. There was another arm of the BPM. It challenged the state through the use of violence. It was known as the National Union of Freedom Fighters, or NUFF. Assumed to be 150 in total, led by Guy Harewood and former TTDF soldier Brian Jeffers. NUFF engaged the coercive arms of the state by effecting guerrilla warfare through firefights, use of IEDs, and bank robberies. They attacked petroleum installations belonging to Texaco and Tesoro foreign oil companies that were deemed as predatory. In some instances, they conducted raids on police stations and murdered police officers. 2 militant members that are worth mentioning are Kirkland Paul and Andy Thomas. Both were arrested in 1973, convicted and sentenced to death in 1975 of the murder of police officer Austin Sankar. The type of guerrilla tactics that NUFF utilized as they operated out of their main jungled-based Northern Range camp proved to be outside the capabilities of the TTPS and its popular and controversial flying squad. The flying squad was led by then Assistant Superintendent Randolph Burrows, who would later become Commissioner of Police. Burrows already led an operation in which several NUFF members were killed in a Laventil Hills hideout. The state responded with a series of joint military and police operations and descended on the Northern Range camp. Brian Jeffers, Rudy John, Beverly Jones, and Kenneth Tenaya were killed in the joint military and police exercise, while Guy Harewood was subsequently killed in October of 1973. The government eventually neutralized or imprisoned members of NUFF, thus bringing an end to the militant arm of the BPM. And though the BPM eventually withered and the PNM were returned after winning 36 seats at the general election, unsettled grievances remained as the wholesome distraction of Republican status riding on the back of a state of emergency was on the horizon. Achieved in 1976 and celebrated on September 24th annually, the date on which the first Republican Parliament was convened, this crucial aspect of institutional decolonization had been effected. The head of state was no longer someone who represented the interests of the British monarch on the Twin Island. 478 years of European and colonial symbols were removed, albeit not entirely, since the Privy Council, which sits in London to date, remains as the Republic's highest appellate court. Republicanism. Spanish Governor-General Don José María Chacón's worst nightmare had come to pass centuries later. And it was believed that this newfound status, which was ushered in by the intellectual generation, would fulfill the entire ambitious goal of self-determination. The legal arrangements meant that the Republic had, as its new cacique, a president who would replace the monarch. As such, the office of the Governor-General disappeared. While it is the contention of many that the president is merely a ceremonial relic and a rubber stamp, the president, as the head of state, assents to laws, provides letters of appointments to ministers, declares an area a disaster area. Further, it was determined paramount that a political leader would not be the commander-in-chief of the TTDF, and that the office of Prime Minister is not vested with control over the military. How would the new republic fare? We will find out in the next episode.